The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. I'm very excited today to have the legendary Steve DeAngelo on the show. Steve is a longtime cannabis activist and advocate, has been dubbed the father of legal cannabis, and is a real pioneer and inspiration to many in this space. There's too many projects that he's involved in, but some of the main businesses that he's co-founded are Harborside Inc., which is one of the first licensed cannabis dispensaries in the US. Steep Hill, which is the first dedicated cannabis lab in the US, if I'm correct. And then Arcview Group, which is the first cannabis investment firm. So lots of firsts there. I'm really excited to speak to Steve today. So welcome, Steve. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Anuj. Very nice to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on. So how are you getting on generally? You know, the world's a bit different at the moment.
Well, the world is very different. Here in California, cannabis has been declared an essential business. So that means that Harborside and all of our dispensaries are up and they are operating, and that's a good thing I think for everybody. On a personal level, I just feel exceptionally fortunate right now. I have a nice home. I'm in that home with people that I love and care about. I have a lot of creative projects to keep me busy, and it turns out that I'm actually finding myself more busy now than I was before the virus, just because so many people are talking in the way that we're talking now and connecting in this new kind of style. And so for me, it's, to be honest with you, I've been feeling a bit guilty about feeling wonderful about some of the things that are happening in my life personally right now.
Yeah, it's a real strange situation, isn't it? It's the same here in London. I'm in a nice house with my kids and the sun is shining. Not everyone is as fortunate as me. So it's a weird mixed feelings, if you like.
Totally weird, right? And I think that, what I've been finding is my normal patterns are a little bit off. So, I'll wake up and I'll find myself in a mood and I'm not sure where that mood came from. And some mornings I wake up and I feel really great and buoyant and hopeful. And then sometimes that's just like this switch gets turned, the despair switch or something. And my spirits sink and my energy flags and I feel a bit overwhelmed. I think that's kind of how it rolls during these times. There is a horrible thing that's happening. The biggest crisis that I've directly experienced in my lifetime. And so, yeah, I think that it's strange, right? Because usually in times of crisis like this, we're all able to come together. We're all pitching in. We're all cleaning up hurricane damage or something together. And now it's different. So,
yeah,
these tides of change, they're going to keep on coming at us. Fortunately, the cannabis community has a lot of experience with rapid change and sometimes unpleasant change. So by and large, I think that we're adapting well to it. And my main concern right now is prisoners. We've seen over 100 deaths of prisoners from coronavirus in the United States. We have for a long time been incarcerating a larger portion of our population than any other nation on earth. And there's no way to social distance. There's no effective medical care there. So that's how I've been spending a lot of my time, is really just trying to draw attention to the plight of people who are not even allowed to take care of themselves.
Yeah. We'll get on to talk about that actually, because it's a really interesting area and project that you're working on. I just thought I looked at your lovely COVID message that was on your website and it really resonated. I'm actually reading that same Michael Pollan book at the moment, which you mentioned, How to Change Your Mind. If you wouldn't mind just sort of repeating it to my audience, you talk a bit about some of the lessons and opportunities of this virus. Would you mind elaborating a bit on that?
No, I'd be happy to. Michael Pollan has this amazing book out now called How to Change Your Mind. And in the book, he introduces, or at least introduced to me, it was a concept called the default mode network. The best way to imagine it is to think of two brain scans side by side. One is a brain scan of a baseline brain that doesn't have any visionary psychoactive substances in it. The other is the brain scan of a brain that has any one of a variety of different psychoactive substances in it, including cannabis. The difference between them is that on the baseline brain, what you see is a narrow band of activity around the perimeter of the brain, which reflects the fact that most of the time our brain is that different parts of our brain are, there's a very small portion of our brain that's active, and that portion that's active, little bits tend to talk to the same bits all the time rather than having conversations with a lot of bits. So it maps as this perimeter of activity around the perimeter of the brain. Once you give that brain psilocybin or cannabis or another visionary substance, what you see is all of these lines of communication crossing the brain scan. So it looks more like a spider web than a band of activity circling the brain. And what that reflects is that you have a lot of different parts of the brain that are talking to each other that normally don't talk to each other. And this is because, well, we have to, right? Our brains necessarily filter out a lot of what we perceive in the course of the day, because if we didn't, we'd never get anything done. We'd sit around like looking at the roses and, thinking about how wonderful and magnificent they were, and we'd never remember to water them, right? Yeah. So we have this executive function, the default mode network. That's where we live most of the time. And it's a useful thing to have. But what we sacrifice by living in the default mode network all the time is the ability to have different kinds of thoughts, different kinds of perceptions. And so when we ingest cannabis, we all know, all of us who use cannabis, that it changes the way that we think. It changes the way that we perceive things. It changes the way that we feel things. And what it does essentially is it knocks us out of that default mode network, the place where our brains spend most of the time, and gives us new insight. So I don't know, in the UK, are you familiar with this term, the stoner epiphany?
No, I'm not actually.
Okay. Well, I think most people who can consume cannabis can imagine what I'm talking about, right? It's that moment where, and for me, it's like at the end of the day, I've had a busy day. I'll come home. This is before the virus, obviously. I'll sit down, I'll consume some cannabis and start relaxing. And my mind generally starts playing some kind of movie. Frequently, it's a movie of what happened in the course of the day. And it might, I might just like remember, oh, dude, you were running down the back hallway of Harborside. You were in such a hurry. You were trying to get to that interview. You didn't even notice your new employee trying to say hello to you. You didn't even remember it till now. And I go, oh, shit, that's right. Really bad. That's not cool. And the other part of myself says, all right, dude, so it's not cool. It wasn't cool. Are you going to do something about it? Or are you just going to sit there? And I go, oh, well, maybe, I got to make this right. Yeah. How would you feel if somebody just blew by you in the hallway? I wouldn't feel very good. So then I reach out, right? And I send a text, or I make a phone call, or I do something to make that right. It's a moment at which I can double check myself. It's a moment at which I can step out of my default mode network and take a look at what I have been doing when I have been in that default mode network, and think about whether it's the place I really want to be. Same thing with the virus today. This virus is like the whole world has been given a massive dose of a psychoactive, call it cannabis, call it psilocybin, anything, right? We have been jolted out of our normal routines. All of the assumptions that usually apply don't. We are perceiving the world and thinking in very different ways. So just as cannabis and the other visionary plants can teach us lessons that are useful in our lives, like the lesson I just talked about, so I think that the virus offers us collectively, the human species, the opportunity for a moment of reflection, to take a step back and ask ourselves what it was about the way that we are leading our lives that led us to this point. And think very seriously about the kind of world that we want to go back to, right? We are out of our default mode network, and we are double checking our own assumptions. And I think that for me, I'm finding some really amazing things. I think about how now when I start a business meeting with people, there's always these moments, really sincere moments of people checking in with each other and connecting with each other and understanding each other on a human level. I think about those canals in Venice running so clear that you can see dolphins swimming in them again. I think about the Himalayas and Mount Kilimanjaro coming into range. They can be seen from cities hundreds of miles away. There are children alive who never saw the view of those mountains before, who now are able to see those beautiful, majestic mountains. I think of all of the parents that I've talked to, like you, who have told me about the opportunity they've had to reconnect with the most important relationships in their lives. And so I think that, for me, it's a time to reflect on how those canals got dirty and how we put those mountains out of view, and how we convinced ourselves that keeping the corporate profit machinery of the world going is more important than the air we breathe or the smiles of our children.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful message, and it's that whole crisis opportunity type thing, isn't it? This is a crazy situation, but maybe there's an opportunity to sort of take stock of all of the things that you mentioned. So let's hope we sort of grasp the opportunity.
Let's hope so. I mean, we're never going to have an opportunity like this before. Okay, world, stay put, sit in your rooms and think about it for several weeks at least, right? It's never happened before. If we're lucky, it won't happen again. Right. So let's, with all of the misery, and, I say all of this acutely conscious that I'm sitting here as a white man in a extraordinarily prosperous part of an extraordinarily prosperous country. And that, in fact, the reality of this for most people around the world is such that it's not going to be a moment of reflection. It is going to be a moment of desperation, a moment of fear, a moment of terror, a moment of sickness, a moment of death. And so those of us who are in this incredibly fortunate position to be able to think about what has happened and consider how we move forward, truly, really, I think, have an obligation to do that. We have been graced with this opportunity. And if we don't take advantage of it, I think that we're squandering something that most people in the world would be so very happy to have right now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, let's move on to the main topic, the other C word, cannabis. I mean, I talk a lot about business on this podcast in terms of like the industry, etc. And obviously, you've got so many things, but I probably want to talk to you about some other stuff. Your just general views on cannabis. But in terms of business, just quickly, I mean, you've been the first in so many areas that we just talked about at the top of the show with all your various ventures. What's your advice to kind of wannabe entrepreneurs, having done it the hard way, I guess?
Well, for me, I've always done two things. I've tried to be of service to this plant, number one. And number two, I've tried to do that in a way that excites me, that gives me joy, that makes my work fun. And that's what I suggest to everybody. So, the success that I've had in business came from looking at the landscape of cannabis and what was going on in it, and trying to understand where the most pressing need was and to fill that need. So when I opened my first legal cannabis business in California, Harborside, we are one of the first 6 licensed cannabis dispensaries in the state of California, or really in the United States of America. But there had been a lot of unlicensed dispensaries in the years previously. And many of them were not people who were motivated to serve medical cannabis patients out of a sense of duty and compassion, but people who really saw an opportunity to bring their underground cannabis selling operations above ground. And some of them did a great job and really served patients well, but a lot of them served patients really poorly and would do, kind of crazy things like having armed guards, having a bunch of very intimidating security equipment, an environment that really looked and felt shady and dangerous. And so what I wanted to do with Harborside was create a gold standard cannabis retail experience that would look and feel like a normal retail experience that most communities would take a look at and be happy to welcome to their town or their village or their city. I wanted to demonstrate to the world that cannabis could be retailed, could be provided to people in a way that brought benefits to the community and not harms. And there was such a need for it. People were so hungry for it. The cannabis consumer flocked to us. We were over $20 million in a year in annual sales in our third year. And because the model was so innovative, because it was so different compared to what anybody else had done at that time, we got a vast amount of media attention, and that just accelerated the success even more. But it grew out of me turning on the television and seeing news stories where there were quote unquote dispensaries that were, full of people just, blazing away, and, people who presented poorly to the camera, who didn't really understand how to explain the medicine. And, this was at a time when we were still being rated by the federal government. And so public image was really, really important. And so it was really out of that sense of a combination of service to the plant, but also something fun. So one of the things that I love doing is bringing cannabis people together, and we're facing some unique challenges on that now. But that's basically how I've spent my career, is creating spaces and experiences where cannabis people can throw off the cloak of secrecy and come together and be with each other, because it's joyous for me, because I've spent so much of my life having to hide who I am, not being able to connect with the other people who, like me, find joy and sustenance and learning and wisdom in this plant. And so I just love, like, every time that a new client walks through Harborside and sees cannabis being presented in this way that it's never been allowed to be presented before, and they have what we call the wow moment, it just makes my heart soar. So duty, service, and doing what you want.
Great.
It's good competition.
Yeah, and that's really good advice and really motivating. And yeah, I mean, considering all the stuff that you've done, it must give you such joy to have that feeling.
Oh, it's just it's like one of these moments where I feel almost too fortunate, because I know what it took to get here. I lived it, and there were decades and decades of really pretty bitter struggle and sacrifice. And a lot of the people who made those sacrifices, who pushed that struggle forward, did not live to see this moment of validation. And it feels really good. Again, it's a time where I really count my blessings that I've been able to be in this time. And even today, even now, when the way that we get together has changed, but we can still do it. I remember a time where if we attempted to have something like an online communication system with a bunch of cannabis people talking about how much we love the plant and how much we want to be in business with it, we would have all been followed. They would have had taps on the lines. We would have had search warrants. We would have been raided. I would have been dragged out of my bed in the early morning hours and locked in a cage. So yeah, feels great.
That's good, man. That's good. That's good. I like that. I mean, that kind of leads very nicely on to my next sort of question. I just finished your book, The Cannabis Manifesto, which is brilliant. I have to say, quite frustrating though. Made me quite angry. All of the injustice and all the bullshit basically that you've had to go through, and that has been sort of propagated by the government and all the people who've been on the wrong side of it. Obviously, things have moved on since I think you wrote the book sort of 3-4 years ago. Is it like that? Something like that?
About 5 years old now.
No, 5 years, yeah. So the cannabis world has changed considerably in that time. I mean, you campaigned for, you've witnessed many different phases of cannabis reform. What stage do you feel like we're at the moment?
Well, I call the stage that we're in now the cannabis renaissance. And it's actually is going to be a book that I'm working on right now. And what I say is basically, just as the original Renaissance in Europe was this period of time where the lost knowledge of ancient civilizations was reclaimed and then was married up with new materials, new production techniques, new discoveries, and new science. And that original Renaissance set off a torrent of positive social change. That's where we're at with cannabis. Modern science has now validated all of these ancient medical uses of cannabis and is proving day by day that cannabis, in fact, is the most valuable medicine on planet Earth. All of the bad, bogus, prohibitionist-funded pseudoscience is falling away in just this tide of research that's being done in places like Israel, right? And theories like the gateway theory and the idea that cannabis leads to addiction or psychosis or criminality are being thoroughly debunked. And that knowledge, that education is in turn leading to legal reform, which has probably gone further in North America than anywhere else around the world right now, but it is coming. It is coming everywhere. I spent 200 days, it's felt like years sometimes, 200 days on the road last year. And I went to 4 continents. I visited emerging cannabis economies all over. And this is something that's sweeping the world. I just read yesterday that Lebanon has now legalized cannabis for medical and industrial purposes. I know that Morocco has been thinking about that and talking about it. And so we're now beginning to see cannabis reform even in the Middle East, which has been one of the parts of the world that has been most resistant to it. So what does that mean? I think that where we are headed is that by dollar volume, cannabis is going to be the most valuable product in the world. I don't know if it happens in my lifetime, but it happens in your lifetime, Anush. Definitely. So imagine, right? Imagine a truck full of packages. The body of that truck is made from hemp plastics. The engine of that truck is powered by electricity produced by a hemp power plant or by hemp biodiesel. The cardboard of all of the boxes is made out of hemp. The plastic that wraps those boxes is made out of hemp. The raw materials and maybe half of the products in those boxes are made out of hemp. The shoes and the socks and the uniform of the driver driving that truck are made out of hemp. When she stops for lunch and goes into a cafe, the linens and the tablecloth are made out of hemp. The salad dressing is pressed hemp seed oil. The food is highly nutritious, very, very rich in all the essential fatty acids. Hemp flour for bread, for pizza, for pasta. All of these things are possible now. And the great thing about it is that hemp, cannabis as an industrial raw material, it's really unparalleled. You can produce more biomass for hemp on 1 acre in one season than you can in several years growing trees. And when you grow cannabis, it sequesters 1.8 metric tons of carbon for every acre of cannabis that's planted. I'm talking acres. You can figure it out in hectares. It's a little bit different. And pulls poison out of the soil. Cannabis is a very powerful phytoremediator. So it cleans up soil. It can be used to clean up marginalized soil. Anything you make out of a tree, out of petroleum or cotton, you can make from hemp, and you don't need to use pesticides and harsh chemicals to grow it. So it's the raw material of the future. Mother Nature, in her wisdom, has given us a plant that at once awakens our spirits and souls and brings us closer to nature, and at the same time gives us the raw material we need to build the new world that we all know we must now move to.
Yeah, the hemp side as a material is so fascinating. 50,000 uses apparently, all of the ones that you mentioned and many more. And I like the way that you picked up on the fact that things are happening across the world in places that we probably weren't expecting them to. I think that makes it really fascinating.
Yes, the box has been opened. It's not going back in. And, this all just comes from the plant herself, from the basic generosity and goodness and value of this plant. And we are now, fortunately, at a place in the world where information technology has made it impossible for governments to continue to lie about this plant. The real knowledge is out. The real information is out. That information is not going away. And there's a worldwide movement, not just of millions of people, but of hundreds of millions of people now around the world who have been touched by this plant. We've all had the same set of experiences. We have drawn the same lessons from those experiences, and we share a common value system. Hundreds of millions of us around the world, different races, different languages, different religions, different economic circumstances. But what is in common? We all value creativity. We think it's a lot more important than conformity. We all value individual freedom. We trust in it much more than we do in governments. We all believe in the sanctity of Mother Earth and know that it's our mission to take care of her. We all believe that there's a better way than war and domination and discrimination. And we look for and we walk that path of peace and love. That is who cannabis people are all over the world. And so we will bring about this renaissance. We will build a new, different kind of world. That's why this plant has been sent to us.
Yeah, really inspiring. So one of the things I've been really interested in is, as you say, North America is kind of leading the way. Canada's obviously gone that step further and is very kind of forward on a lot of stuff in this area. But obviously California has been at it for quite a while as well. Why do you think it's happening now? You've been campaigning for several decades. Why now? Why in the last sort of 5 years or so?
You want the cosmic reason? I mean, there's a lot of different reasons. Yeah. I mean, seriously, I think that the reason that we are being called to this mission now at this time is because we are running out of time. If the human species does not learn how to open its hearts to one another, does not learn how to revere Mother Nature as the giver of all of our lives, if we do not learn how to work out our inevitable differences without violence, our children, will not have a world to live in. It will be a cinder. We will cut down the last tree on the planet. And so there needs to be not a revolution of politics. There needs to be a revolution of the heart. And this plant has been sent to us, help us find that path, and to help us open our hearts to each other and learn a better way of living. And I think the reason now is simple. We're running out of time. On a more practical level, I think that a lot of what is driving the cannabis renaissance forward and cannabis reform forward is just the science, the facts that are coming out, and which is a great thing. They're coming out now via the internet. So when I first started doing this 50 years ago, if I wanted to catch the government in a lie, I had to go to a university library, which I had to sneak into because I wasn't old enough to be there yet. I would have to dig up some old original source material before U.S. Prohibition. So one of my favorite sources was the 1897 East India Report, which was commissioned by the English Parliament and was one of the most comprehensive, to this day, most comprehensive studies and most scientific studies of cannabis. And then I would compare that report against whatever garbage the government was putting out that day, week, month, etc. I remember when it was that we were all going to grow breasts, right? That men that consume cannabis, we're all going to have breasts, right? And but then once I found the government lie, then how would I let people know about it? Well, I'd have to type up an article. Then I'd have to run that article off on these machines we called mimeograph machines, which were basically these little in-home printing machines, right? Then I'd have to fold it up, put it into an envelope, stamp the envelopes, take it to the post office, and hope that the post office didn't intercept it because it was unacceptable material for them. So now if I hear about some garbage prohibitionist pseudo fact, I just pull out my phone. I reach out to my network. I say, hey, could you guys check this out? Let me know what the real science is. An hour later, I have the information. It takes me 5 minutes to write it up and push it out to 150,000 people all around the world, who then are pushing it all around the world. So the freedom of truth, right? That truth and science do move a lot more freely now than they did when I was growing up. And so it's evident that cannabis is not a bad plant. Cannabis is a good plant. Cannabis brings benefits. It doesn't bring harms. And exactly the kind of benefits that we need in the world today. And that's what's powering it. Yeah.
I think the unfortunate thing is because of many, many decades of stigma, the bar is almost higher to overcome in order to get it accepted. But as you say, that knowledge is starting to become very open and prominent.
Look, you take a look at the demographics of people who oppose cannabis reform. They're almost all old. right? It's like 87 or 90% of young people support cannabis reform. So unless human beings like stop dying and start hanging around for a lot longer, right? This change is inevitable, okay? The people who were raised on a diet of stigma and superstition will die off. And younger generations that have access to the real science are coming of age. And we're already seeing that process happen now in North America and Canada. Another reason that you're seeing the change now is there's a generational shifting of the guard. And you're seeing young people who did not grow up with stigma, who aren't blinded by superstition, who are now moving into positions of political power. So I talked to my friend Eric Swalwell, who is a congressman from California who sits on the Intelligence Committee of the U.S. Congress and was one of the main questioners during the whole Russia investigation. And Eric is a very, very steadfast cannabis supporter. He's a good bit younger than me and is part of the generation I'm talking about. Gavin Newsom, governor of California, strong proponent of cannabis reform, same thing. So I think part of this is also generational. But look, it's what we've learned. What I learned is that each country has its unique history and cultural relationship with cannabis, and the unraveling of prohibition will happen differently in different places around the world. But I see it happening everywhere. I see, now there are literally tens of millions of young people who have grown up not on a diet of stigma, but on a diet of truth about cannabis. And they are the army that is not just going to make cannabis legal in every country around the world, but is actually going to save this world. We are not going to head off climate change. We are not going to end the horrifying kinds of wars that we've had by thinking and feeling the same way that we have. We need to think and feel differently, and cannabis is one of the most effective tools, not the only tool, but one of the most effective tools to break us out of that default mode network that has gotten us into such trouble.
Yeah. And so fingers crossed for the coming years, and that we actually wake up and do these things. And so now let's kind of maybe go on to the thing you were talking about at the beginning, the Last Prisoner Project, which I know is a massive part of your life. Would you mind just telling the audience a bit about it and what it's all about?
The purpose of the Last Prisoner Project is simple and single-minded. We want to make sure that as a legal cannabis industry is built around the world, that people who are still in prison on cannabis charges for doing the same thing that is now legal are released and have an opportunity to rebuild their lives. This is a problem that varies from place to place. In the United States, we have over 40,000 people who are still in prison on cannabis charges, and a significant number of them are there on life sentences without parole for non-violent cannabis crimes. One of our constituents, Michael Thompson, African American, and it's important to recognize that there's been a tremendous disparity in cannabis arrests, where people of color are arrested at multiples more frequently and then punished more severely than white people are. So Michael was sentenced to 60 years in prison for selling 3 pounds of cannabis to an undercover officer. He has served 27 years of that sentence now. He's 68 years old. He has significant underlying health issues, and COVID has now infected the prison that he's at. And this already egregious and awful, horrible sentence that 27 years of Michael's life has been stolen because he provided a healing plant to somebody. Now that already egregious sentence is, we hope that it does not turn into a death sentence. And there's prisoners all over the world. We don't know how many. So our mission's simple. We want every one of them to come home. That's why we called it the Last Prisoner Project. And that's what we mean in our promise to every single person who's in prison around the world, to their families, and to the cannabis industry and the cannabis community at large, is that we will not stop and we will not rest until we bring the last cannabis prisoner home.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously a huge problem in the US, but also around the world. And yeah, there's a cannabis economy that's being created by this renaissance, and no pun intended, but it is criminal that there's so many people that are excluded from it because they were incarcerated unjustly.
Yeah, and it's again, it's mostly people of color who have been prosecuted this way. Is that people who have connections, people who do deals with corrupt governments and cops to do business generally don't end up in prison. It's the people that haven't been able to negotiate those kind of subterranean pathways that end up being victimized. But for me, it's very simple. If we as a society decide that something's not going to be a crime anymore, then the people who are being punished for the thing that we've decided isn't going to be a crime anymore should not continue to be punished. It's very simple. I have another motivation, right? Because I don't think that they ever were criminals. The people who carried this plant through prohibition, through all of this oppression, who brought this healing plant that's not just good for healing individual humans, it's good for healing our society and our planet. They're not criminals. They're heroes. They're heroes. I believe that this plant is going to help us save the planet. And so the people who are carrying this plant, who are helping awaken that consciousness in our hearts of millions of people around the world, of helping us open our hearts and learn how to love each other and find a peaceful path to walk, they're heroes and they should be honored. And I want to make sure that as we close this period of history, that there's an appropriate reckoning. The real criminals are the people that lied, the people who knew what the real science was, who put these laws into place to advance their own positions of power. Those are the real criminals. And even them we should forgive, because that's what this plant teaches us to do. But there must be an accounting, there must be a reckoning, there must be an atonement. We must understand how it was that this healing plant was not turned into, but became the focus of this kind of horrible oppression to make sure it never happened.
Yeah, the tool of oppression bit is, you talk a lot about it in your book. And I think that, I can't remember which US government body, but there's a bit where you talk about they're sort of consistently trying to prove something. And then all of the doctors seem to, they do the research and they realize it isn't bad. And they sort of resign from the organization. And it just was, yet the organization carried on trying to push out lies and stuff.
Yeah, you're talking about this is the National Institute on Drug Abuse.
That's the one, yeah.
Is the official institute of the U.S. government, which has received billions of dollars over the years to study cannabis. But all of their studies are designed to show that cannabis is harmful. So they ran 3 studies trying to show that cannabis causes cancer and various different types of cancer. The first 2 studies came back saying, no, actually, cannabis has very potent cancer-fighting properties. It's not carcinogenic. And they kept on trying. So they found this Dr. Donald Tashkin. And Tashkin had done a couple of studies on cannabis previously and found some alleged harms. So they thought he was reliable. And they decided they were going to do lung cancer. And they figure, hey, it's smoke. It's got to cause lung cancer. So Tashkin gives 3 groups of subjects cannabis, measures the incidence of lung cancer in 3 different types of people. So Tashkin looks at 3 groups of people. 1, people who smoke tobacco, 2, people who smoke cannabis, and 3, people who smoke nothing at all. And he was astonished when he found out that the lowest incidence of lung cancer was in the people who smoked cannabis. The second lowest of incidence of lung cancer was in people who smoked nothing at all. And the highest incidence of lung cancer, of course, was in the people who smoked tobacco. Why is this? Because we know that cannabis smoke, like other smoke, does contain tars and other carcinogenic substances. The reason is because the cannabinoids in cannabis are so potently anti-cancer, such potent anti-cancer agents that they offset the tar in the smoke. So in all 3 cases, the NIDA attempted to suppress this information. The only reason that we know about it is because another doctor found out about the Tashkin report and leaked it to the public. And once that happened, Dr. Tashkin then endorsed the legalization of cannabis. So the question, though, is that was the first study came in 1973. It's now 2020. The U.S. government's official position continues to be that there is no medical benefit for cannabis whatsoever. I haven't looked up the figures of how many millions of people have died from cancer during that period of time, or how many millions of their family members have had to go through the misery of a death by cancer, but it's a lot. And we don't know for sure because there haven't been enough clinical studies how many of them could have been saved by cannabis. But even if it's only 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 out of those many, many millions, it's a significant number. And I suspect that it's a lot higher than that. So prohibition hasn't been this thing where it's just, oh, we've denied people the right to get high. Prohibition has killed millions of people.
Yeah, really frustrating. But I've had a guy called Professor Dedi Mary, who's a professor at Technion University in Israel, and he's studying this, and it's fascinating and really promising.
There's so much hopeful and wonderful stuff going on. And, you know, I tend to focus on the struggle part of this because I'm acutely conscious that in most parts of the world, cannabis continues to be illegal, that people continue to face the death penalty in countries for cannabis. So I do, but the hope side of this is amazing. The things that we're discovering about cannabis medicine are just, it's you know, you think about just the children who have intractable childhood epilepsy, whose lives have been completely changed by the introduction of cannabis therapeutics. And these are, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of kids whose lives were just really, you know, one day of misery after another for as long as they could see into the future, who now are having seizure-free days, who are happy kids, who are living more or less, you know, normal developmental paths and curves, and so are their parents. And we're just seeing that. I have seen that, you know, for years. It's one reason I'm so passionately dedicated to cannabis is, you know, I spent years working in the dispensary and seeing people walk in and just have their lives transformed. You know, I came out to California having been a cannabis activist for a long time before we knew about the medical properties of cannabis. And to be completely 100% honest with you, you know, part of my attitude when I got here was, great, if we can convince people that cannabis has medical properties, let's convince them of that. But there wasn't, you know, I myself, my level of being convinced wasn't quite as deep as I recognize now that it could and should have been, right? Because after spending a few years watching people with cancer, people with epilepsy, watching people with multiple sclerosis, watching people with ALS, watching people with really, really grave medical conditions come into Harborside and be healed by cannabis, really changed that perception for me and made me understand cannabis is the most valuable medicine on the planet.
It's really honest of you as well that your views modified and that, you know, you maybe had different motivations to begin with, but the case is so compelling. It's one of the reasons why I've got into this in the last 2 years, because of all the things that you've said are really inspirational and the real chance for positive change. I mean, one of the other things I wanted to ask you was, in the book, you also talk about, I think, one of your very young experiences was with your parents and kind of getting involved in the civil rights movement. Was that an inspiration for the Last Prisoner Project, that kind of experience that you had?
I think so. I hadn't really, until you mentioned it, specifically traced it, but I grew up in a civil rights family at a time when the civil rights struggle in the United States was at its peak. So I was 5 years old in 1963 when Martin Luther King made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. I was there. I don't remember the speech, but I do remember making sandwiches, like more sandwiches than I'd ever seen, with my mom before we went down there, and then handing out the sandwiches to people who were marching. You know, I remember that people who were going down south, students who were going down south to desegregate the South, some of whom were killed and never came back, were given a place to sleep in my parents' basement as they were driving from the north to the south, coming from places like Massachusetts down to places like Georgia. So it's literally, really in my blood. I always grew up thinking that racism was this vestige of the past that was, by the time I was an adult, it was going to be gone. And, one of the most shocking things of my life has been to see an actual resurgence of racism, to see this massive, massive, massive incarceration of people of color in the United States, which, until you've actually been locked up in a prison and see what it's like and feel like itself, it's hard to imagine it. But it's very clear when you're there and you're like, one white guy and there's 100 black and brown people who are there, very clear what's going on. And so I guess that, I know that my parents' activism gave me an example that I knew from a very young age, that if I saw something bad and unjust happening and I had the power to stand up and do something about it, that I also had the obligation to stand up and do something about it. That's how I was raised, and that's how I've lived my life.
Yeah, that's great to hear, and glad that it moved you to do all of the wonderful things that you've done. Just conscious that we're getting towards the end of the show, so maybe as we get towards the end, we've talked about COVID on the grand scale of taking this opportunity. How do you think COVID's going to affect cannabis reform across the world? There's a few different views on it. Have you got any ideas on what you think is going to happen?
Well, if Lebanon is any indication, it's going to accelerate things. So here's what I know about cannabis is that, in my experience, cannabis has been at least moderately helpful for every human medical condition that I know of. There's not a single one that it hasn't helped for. We also know that cannabis is an incredibly complex plant, and that there are a lot of different components in it that may account for its various different therapeutic effects. We just got some very, very interesting news from researchers at the University of Alberta, who in test tube studies are saying that they're seeing an increased resistance to COVID, that cannabis can increase resistance to COVID because of its antiviral properties. This is a body of research that's been going on for at least 10 years, as far as I can determine. There is compelling evidence that cannabis can slow viral infection spread rates. None of that science has been taken from a test tube level to a human clinical trials level yet. I hope that happens soon, because I would be very surprised if we didn't see at least some positive therapeutic effect from cannabis as relates COVID, just because cannabis is so beneficial for almost every other type of human medical condition. And the reason for that is simple for those of your viewers who might not know. The way that cannabis works in our body is to preserve or restore homeostasis, which is the scientific term for our body's state of natural balance. This is why cannabis is so effective for such a wide range of seemingly unrelated medical conditions. Cancer, anxiety, depression, insomnia, seizures. There's just a wide range of things that cannabis is effective for. And it's because of that basic homeostatic property that it has, that it brings us into balance with our body. So assuming for the moment that what we have learned about cannabis and every other medical condition that human beings have proves true with COVID, one would think that a medicine that helps protect or treat COVID is something that would advance cannabis reform. I think another thing that's absolutely going to happen is, just like the information about cannabis is now out in the public, people have seen the images of those canals in Venice running clear. They have seen Mount Kilimanjaro. They have seen the Himalayas. They've seen the largest drop in polluting emissions in modern history. They've heard the birds and the trees singing that they haven't been able to hear for decades. I don't think people are going to forget that. And I think that young people especially have seen that the way that we've been building the world doesn't work, and are going to be looking for a different way. And cannabis is that way. So I think that this crisis is going to massively accelerate cannabis reform around the world.
Yeah, I hope so too.
It will. It will if we make
Yeah.
it. Right. It will if we make it. This is, it's important for your audience to understand that this is something that's within grasp. It wasn't a bunch of institutions or university studies or philanthropists that made cannabis change happen in North America. I was there, and I can tell you that it was a band of outcasts. It was a band of revolutionaries. It was people who did not have a whole lot of resources, but we had absolute fierce determination. And we dedicated our lives to this. There was a group of 50 or 100 people who in the 1970s dedicated their lives to making cannabis reform a real thing. And had they not done that, it wouldn't have happened.
Mm.
So the converse is true. It can happen anywhere, wherever your audience is hearing my words. If you believe in this plant, if you take the lessons that she teaches us seriously, and if you teach those lessons and carry her to other people, this will happen. I have seen it. It is within our grasp. It's not a noble mission. It's something that we can get done. Mother Nature has given us the raw materials. Now it's just up to our hands and our imaginations and our will to make it into this new world.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Great. So my traditional final question is, what did your mum and dad say when you first got into cannabis? So I guess it's a bit different for you because, you were activist first very early on. I think you also mentioned in the book that it wasn't the easiest initial conversation with them, but...
No, it was terrible, right? Cannabis was the first time that I ever lied to my parents. It was the first major real thing in my life that I hid from them. And, I think it was at once a tragic instinct and a accurate instinct, because once they found out about my involvement with cannabis, they were, unalterably opposed to it. And even though they were civil rights activists, they did not approve of me using cannabis or even more so, selling cannabis. And, I started selling cannabis basically at the same time that I started using cannabis. And so, it was basically took about 2 years from the time that my parents discovered my cannabis use until I was out of the house entirely. I left home when I was 16 years old. And it really, damaged the relationship that I had with my parents for many, many years. There was a period of time that I didn't speak to my father for 3 years. And it was all directly related to cannabis. And, what I would give now to have those 3 years with my dad back then, now that he's passed. And so it's another one of the ways that that cannabis prohibition, even before anybody gets arrested or gets touched by the criminal justice system, this beast puts its hand into the bosom of our families and starts disrupting our relationships. And now, as I've grown older, I've learned that it's not just children lying to their parents. It's parents lying to the children. So you've got the kids who are going out and smoking weed and hiding it from the parents. The parents are hiding it from the kids. They're both doing it, right? And so this horrible beast of distrust reaching into our families. So yeah, it was.
Did they ever come around to it? Did you?
Yeah, they came around. They're rational people. It took them a long while, but they did come around. And so, by the end of their lives, both of my parents were using cannabis on a daily basis. My mom had from Alzheimer's. And so cannabis was really the one thing that could calm her down and bring her some joy when she was otherwise seemed to really be feeling confusion and despair. And my father, who was lucid until the end of his life, used cannabis for a whole range of properties. And, by the end of his life, I was sending him all kinds of packages and instructions. And so, yeah, it all worked out very well in the end. And they ended up, I think, being proud of the work that I've done.
I'm sure. Cool. Well, Steve, thank you so much. Real honor to spend this time with you and for you to share your wisdom and insight with my audience. So I'm really looking forward to putting this show out.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it too, and I'm happy to come back anytime. One of my ambitions is to write the UK version of the Cannabis Manifesto, because it's a different story in every country. And
Sure.
I know a little bit of that UK story, but I'd like to learn the whole thing. And then to, of course, tour and do book readings and really start sinking my teeth into cannabis reform in the UK and see if I can help energize things a bit there.
Yeah, we would absolutely welcome your help. And if there's anything I could do, I would love to get involved in that. So yeah. Steve, thank you so much. And yeah, have a lovely day.
Thank you, Anush. Be well, be free, stay strong.
Cheers. Thank you.